Hello and welcome to the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum podcast series on item histories. For this series, we'll be taking a look at items from the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum, which is located on the University of Exeter campus. We'll be taking items from the museum and providing context for them, discussing their history and their importance to the museum. We are student interns Jess and Chloé. Hi, Chloé.
Hi, Jess.
And we are today joined by Dr Phil Wickham. Phil is the curator of the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum and an academic at the University of Exeter. And today we'll be discussing the golden age of cinema and film paratexts. Hi, Phil. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Jess and Chloé. Nice
Hello.
to be here.
Okay, so for our first question, a lot of people say that the timeline for the golden age is disputed. Why is this the case?
Well, golden ages are always interesting because they're always made up years later. No one ever thinks they're living in a golden age until after it's finished.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think it's a phrase that's been used to talk about a certain period in cinema history. Of course, in some respects, it's a fiction. There were bad films as well as good films. But I think the reason that the period roughly from the 1920s to the 1950s has been called the golden age for cinema is because that's when it was at its most powerful, when it was to the greatest extent a part of people's everyday life, when the industry was very strong and economically successful.
Right.
So I think in later years people look back on this time. And of course, it was also the time of extremely high cinema-going numbers. Yeah, and once those started to decline, then in retrospect, it started to look like a golden age, certainly for the industry, but in some respects also for the audience in terms of how they connected with cinema.
Was it around the 60s, the 50s, 60s that it started to decline?
Yeah, the peak of cinema going in Britain is 1946, just after the Second World War, when there's an enormous number. I think it's 1,635 million admissions in Britain,
goodness.
In a country then that would have been 50 million people.
Yeah.
And that had built up through the 30s into the 40s, despite even the war going on. And that's people going 5, 6, 7 times a week. A lot of people doing that.
Seeing every film there is to see.
Yeah, and it being a part of the really the basis of people's leisure lives. If they weren't at work, they would be in the cinema. It was cheap. It was readily available. There were cinemas kind of all around people. And it was also a place that would be kind of better than your house. People were living in cramped conditions. The cinemas had been built to be spectacular, to be stylish. They were warm. They were a place where you could get sort of company. So they were places that people wanted to be. So you had this huge cinema-going population through to the late 40s. But from that peak, it starts to decline. And then from the mid-50s onwards, it declines very rapidly. Wow. There are many reasons for that. Usually it's seen as the beginning of television. And that's certainly a part of that, particularly in Britain. The advent of ITV in 1955 really starts to spur the decline. But there are other reasons that go along with that. Part of it is social change. People started moving to the suburbs.
Yeah.
They often weren't cinemas there. There'd been an embargo on building work for anything other than houses after the war, so you couldn't build new cinemas for a long time. And the existing cinemas started to fall into disrepair. And they started from being this amazing place where you'd have 1,000 people, all laughing and, crying together. If a building's falling down and the rain's coming in, and then there becomes less and less of you, then it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes less kind of desirable and less fashionable to go to this place. So that's really what started to happen. So I think you can say from the mid-50s in Britain is when the decline really starts to pick up. And that carries on really until the end of the 80s when multiplexes come in. Things start to pick up a little bit again. And until the COVID pandemic, things have been pretty stable for about 15 years, really, in terms of attendances. They were obviously a lot less than there had been in the Golden Age, but they were about sort of 100 to 150 million admissions a year, which is, it was pretty, business was going well. I mean, I think it's an important point is that people often think, oh, well, cinema has been in decline for a long time, and it's the internet and other things have taken over from it. That's really not the case. If you look at 2018, that was the best year for cinema attendances in Britain since 1971.
Oh, okay.
So the business was going great until COVID.
Yeah.
Obviously, COVID has been a real body blow to the industry, and it has recovered more slowly than people hoped.
Yes.
But it is picking up a little bit now.
Yeah,
So I'm certainly not writing it off.
No,
Yeah.
We chose, so for our item history for the podcast, we chose our 4 postcards of 4 famous Golden Age stars. So we have Howard Keel, Gene Kelly, Deborah Kerr, and Grace Kelly. So at the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum, we have sort of a plethora of star portraits, photographs, cigarette cards, and we wondered what these different photographs were used for. And are these pictures an early form of a sort of merchandise, memorabilia type thing, and how this was linked to sort of the idea of fan culture?
Yes, they are merchandise.
Yes.
They are memorabilia. And they've been going for quite a long time by this point. So all those stars are, these cards are from the 50s.
Yeah.
I think they come from Picture Goer magazine, which
do.
was the biggest British fan magazine at the time, which had been going for some years. So merchandise and memorabilia really gets going in the 1910s and becomes a big part of the cinema experience, becomes part of how people relate to what they see on the screen. And also from the industry's point of view, it becomes a really important part of promoting the films, but also promoting stars.
Right.
So until the 50s, stars were usually contracted to particular studios. They sort of belonged and were employed by a certain studio. So it's in the studio's interest to kind of publicise their stable of stars and have them associated with their products, if you like. So they would often choose their roles and decide what these stars would look like and what they would sound like and what kind of films they would be in.
Wow, that's crazy.
That started to sort of be broken in the 40s. So Betty Davis was a Warner Brothers star, and she took them to court because she wasn't happy with the kind of roles that she was offered. And the same with Olivia de Havilland, who only died last year. So they started to kind of exert their own sort of power, stars. They had to say, well, no, we don't want to be treated like this. We wanted to have choice and agency in what we do. And also there was various court cases that took away the power of the studios to both make films, distribute films, and own cinemas. So they had to break up that sort of monopoly, which meant they became less powerful. So as the 50s go on, the studios become much less powerful. Stars start to have their own kind of agency. But at the same time, the numbers are declining. I mean, all those stars were very different. But they would be advertised in a similar way. They appeared in different kinds of films. Deborah Kerr is British. The others are American, but they Howard Keel was in musicals.
Yes.
As was Gene Kelly. Grace Kelly obviously was a kind of leading lady who retired at the height of her fame to become a princess, as you do. Deborah Kerr was a Scottish actress who'd appeared in a number of British films and then became a star in Hollywood. These kinds of memorabilia were really important because it had been established, really as the film industry becomes a huge kind of big multinational business, that fans wanted to see and engage with stars beyond just seeing them in the films.
Right.
They wanted to have them as part of their lives away from the cinema screen. They wanted to know more about them. They wanted to see their image on things like postcards or cigarette cards, or buy merchandise in some cases that was branded with them. They were both a sort of point of identification. I want to be like them, but also aspiration. You know, I want to change to have my life be more like theirs. And stars are really interesting in understanding society and culture at the time. You know, they're always more than just being an actor who appears in particular films. They represent certain things, or certain things are kind of recognised by the audience in them that they identify. And of course, that might not be really what the real actor's like as a person, but that doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And also their meanings can change over time, as you can see with all our Marilyn Monroe
Yeah,
material,
absolutely.
for example. You know, we look for different things at different times, depending on what we're talking about as a society. So a magazine like Picturegoer would produce cards which would help promote the magazine by using the popularity of the stars. Cigarette cards, as you've mentioned here, they were really popular. So they come in the 1910s. And the idea was that you'd have these cards that would be in a pack of cigarettes, and then you would collect a set that you'd put into an album. And film stars, they weren't just about film stars, but film stars were one of the most popular subjects. So we've got many, many cards in the museum from probably about 1915 or so up to about 1960. That being the point, of course, at which people realised that cigarettes were really bad for you, and that this was not a good way to try to encourage people to buy more cigarettes by having cards in wasn't perhaps the best way of doing things. So the cards are often really beautiful. They are lovely things. They're an incredibly good quality paper, so they never seem to age. And, you know, some of them are very beautiful in their design and everything. You can see how the stars were promoted. So on the one side, you'd have usually a quite stylized photograph or a painting that's based on a photograph. At the top, you'd see the branding of the actual cigarettes. On the back, you'd get a little potted biography. And that would be, it would often be a way in which the studios, in partnership with the cigarette company, would maybe launch new stars. It was a way of getting communication to the fans about a little bit more about them alongside the fan magazine material. And you'll see they're often shown in a similar kind of way. So you'd have a set of cards that might be particular film stars. It might be scenes from films with the stars in them. But although the ethics of selling cigarettes is very dubious, as objects they are really beautiful and interesting. And they're something that is, is still sort of fascinating to look at today.
Absolutely.
I love that. And obviously we spoke about picture goers, but what other items in the museum from the Golden Age do we have at the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum? And what do they reveal to us about film culture and just the industry at the time?
Well, I think it shows just how sort of ubiquitous cinema was in this period, say from the 20s to the 50s. It was such an integral part of people's everyday lives. It was by far the dominant form of entertainment and the most significant entertainment business. So when the Hollywood studios form in the 1910s, really from then until they start to be, their power starts to dissipate a bit in the 50s, they become a sort of international kind of corporate titan that is exported all around the world. The studio system was very efficient. It made lots of films. Often those films are fantastic. You know, they're brilliant at storytelling. They are really visually interesting. The stars are, you know, hugely charismatic and exciting to watch. And they all offer something a little bit different to people for their lives. And they would use fan magazines, are a fascinating kind of material. So in Britain, Picturegoer was the market leader. And then there was Picture Show, which was a bit more pictorial, had a bit less detailed articles, but more pictures. You'd also, in the States, have things like motion picture, photoplay, things like that. And they would follow stars' lives. There'd be a sort of version of the stars' lives for the public, would be kind of displayed. It would promote new talent. It would sometimes use stars as a way of talking about social change and talking about things like that. It's interesting to look at them because they're not always kind of what you think they'll be. So if you look at some of our material from the 50s, you know, the idea today is that the 50s was a time of sort of drabness and repression and so on in Britain. And to an extent it was, but also if you look at these magazines, they can seem actually quite modern in their concerns. They're, you know, often slightly racier than you imagine they're going to be. And, you know, people were very aware of the way that the world was changing and they wanted to engage with that in all sorts of different ways. And of course, the audience until the 50s, the audience for cinema was predominantly female. So it was all of this kind of sort of paratexts, these ephemera,
Yeah.
were aimed for a predominantly female audience.
Right.
So if you look at Picture Goer, it looks like a women's magazine.
Yes.
Even some of the adverts are very.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
I remember when we
yeah,
talked about it.
absolutely,
Yeah.
And you can really see the change if you compare Picture Goer to, say, Empire magazine, the dominant film magazine in the UK today, which is the shift comes really, I suppose, in the 70s where the audience becomes more male.
Yeah,
But that had
blockbusters.
been happening for a bit, yeah. But if you look at the adverts in Empire, for example, they're clearly aimed at young males, whereas if you look at Picture Goer, they're clearly aimed at
Yeah.
a quite particular audience. So
Yes.
sort of aspirational working class women between about 18 and 40,
Yeah.
I'd say,
Yeah.
mainly urban.
Yeah.
So, I think that shows the importance of this kind of material to reflect a culture in which cinema was hugely significant in people's lives and spoke to people about the way they lived. Also, it gave them a way of understanding a world beyond their immediate experience.
Yeah.
So you're seeing different parts of the world that you've never been to. You're seeing different lives that you're not
Yes.
leading. So
Yeah.
one of the big, the British establishment used to be quite concerned about Hollywood films because in America it showed working people who were quite a lot richer than we were in Britain. Had more stuff, and more things, as well as having what seemed to the British audience a more democratic voice kind of away from the class system. Yeah. So it was giving a new way of looking at it. Now, of course, it's about capitalism and all those kind of things, but it's still offering seeing something that's different.
Yeah. Yeah. So as a sort of final question then, what impact do you think the museum has? You're the curator, you might be quite biased, but on the life of the university and sort of beyond that?
Well, I am biased, but
yes, as you should be.
But I do think it's a hugely significant collection that we hold here at the museum. It's over 86,000 items now and rising all the time. And I think it tells the story of moving images as a kind of people's history of culture. The way that people have responded to what they've seen on the screen, different ways of seeing the world. And I think for the university, it's a unique asset. We use this in over 100 classes a year across a range of disciplines, but it's also open to everyone. It's for the public. That's what Bill Douglas and his friend Peter Jewell, who he collected with, that's what they always had in mind. This would be something that would be shared with everybody.
Yeah.
And I think it helps us understand the world in which we live better.
Yes.
And I think it offers a fascinating way into perceiving how we live, perceiving the world that we see, and the way in which cinema and the kind of moving pictures that preceded cinema kind of offer a commentary on this, but also can have helped us change the way that we see things.
Yeah.
So I think it really is something that is completely different to any other university in the UK.
Absolutely.
We've got great academics, obviously great research, great students. But what nobody else has got is this amazing collection. And we are also offering it and sharing it with everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for your
so
time,
much.
Phil.
Thank you.
Jess, Chloé.